I'm so glad to see both the gray hairs and not so gray hairs. This is going to be a special evening, I think, of a journey over 40 years. And from someone who could tell perhaps better than most of us remember. So I'm just going to welcome you all, and I'm going to invite Spolstia to introduce our guest this evening. And let's just begin this journey together.
I only have 15 pages here. It's just been going around my head on how to do this. It's my pleasure, of course, to introduce you to Dr. Christopher Meiklejohn, Professor Emeritus at the University of Winnipeg. Chris was one of the original gang of 6 who initiated the birth of the Canadian Association for Physical Anthropology. And that was 40 years ago. Hard to believe, in 1972 at Lawrence, Kansas. And he's going to tell you about the details, so I'm not going to go into that. The reason I'm here is, believe it or not, Chris and I were graduate students together at the University of Toronto in, it's hard to accept this, I know if you look at both of us, together even, in the mid to late 60s. But Chris and I were the youngest students ever to be, at the ages of 6 and 5, to be admitted to the graduate school at the University of Toronto. In our audience tonight is, she was merely a baby at the time, Dr. Meiklejohn. She was a 4th year student then. Chris and I talked on the phone last week because I was trying to think of something I could say, right? And we talked to each other about things neither of us could remember. It's a long time ago. But we were on the ground floor. I'm not going to take too much of your thunder here, but as graduate students at the University of Toronto, we were on the ground floor of what later became known as bioarchaeology in Canada. We were students of Dr. Jim Anderson, along with our cohort names such as Jerry Melby, Bobby Sundick, who was my roommate at the time, Mike Petroshevsky, Jim McDonald, Lindsay Neiman. Who did I forget? You? Anyway, we were Sonny Turkins.
Sonny Jeff.
And Jeff Garrity, right, Jeff Garrity. So we were cool, you know, this was when bioarchaeology, we didn't even know the word at the time, it was on the cusp of an explosion, which then Chris will tell you about. Now, Chris, I remember, grew up in Ottawa, and I thought his parents lived there, but I was driving him to the airport, or picking him up from the airport, or taking him somewhere. I remember that episode on Bronson Avenue, dropping you off, but it was his wife's parents' house that I dropped you off at, right? But growing up in Ottawa, Chris went to Carleton University. And Chris was born in England, but he grew up in Ottawa. This is something I didn't know before. You were like a whiz kid at Carleton University. He was a research assistant in mammalogy in his freshman year. No? Okay. You were a research assistant in
My 3rd year.
Your 3rd year?
My 3rd year.
When you were 10.
I didn't say 1961.
You can say 63.
Oh, okay.
I think some were 63.
I guess it's a typo here. Anyway, anyway, you were in micro
Then,
paleontology?
yeah,
Paleontology and mammalogy. And then you went to the University of Toronto after that to take a Master of Philosophy, MPhil or Phil-M degree. But somewhere along the way, you actually got a job teaching
yeah,
while you were at Toronto at the University of Pennsylvania
yeah.
for your, you can keep, reminding me what this stuff is. And then you left Toronto in 1970 to take a job with the University of Winnipeg. And he went for the next 37 years at the University of Winnipeg, retiring in 2007. Chris has got a publication list as long as all our arms together. Well over 100 titles published, I think 125 to be exact. And most of that has been in the field of Upper Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic physical anthropology, and archaeology, mortuary archaeology, in Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and Northwest Africa. But he didn't entirely forsake the country of his education. His MPhil thesis was on the facial morphology of Arctic Mongoloids, with the reference to Eskimo, or Inuit as we call them today. And I believe you've done something like 30 cases for the heritage branch of the province of Manitoba, identifying human remains from various archaeological sites. Plus, he spent 30 years doing forensic anthropology with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Manitoba, and also with the various RCMP detachments. So he's got a long history of Canadian physical anthropology or forensic anthropology, as well as all the work he's done in the other side of the planet. So without further ado, I am going to let Chris take up this conversation and tell you the rest of his life. Chris?
Thank you very much, Jerry.
Oh, you're welcome. Anytime.
That scares me, that introduction.
Now the pressure's on.
Now the pressure is definitely on. I'm going to talk really, there are really three topics here that I wanted to cover. The first two feed into each other. I don't want to simply start with what happened in Lawrence in '72, and in fact, what is rather interesting is that discussion with Jerry, plus with several people here over the last day, have brought certain things to mind about what actually happened in '72. But I wanted to put it into the context of something which I don't think is taught a lot, which is the history of the discipline. So I'm going to start with the first 10 minutes or so are going to be on physical anthropology in Canada. Where did it come from? And basically, where was it in the period which Jerry was talking about, the 60s and the 70s. And then I'm going to end this one simply on a personal note on the what did I do in the 40 years that I was working in the field. So I'm going to give you some overview of the work that I've been doing, which, as Jerry indicated, is largely non-North American and is also to a large degree not within the center of physical anthropology. A lot of the people I work with on a day-to-day basis in Europe assume I'm an archaeologist who happens to do human bone rather than the other way around. And most of the meetings I go to are in fact identifiable not as physical anthropology meetings, but as archaeology meetings. So that's where I'll end. So, starting, get this thing going. Starting with the whole issue of physical anthropology and some markers on this, some of this will probably be old hat. But two aspects of a discipline. I'm going to definitely go to the question of problems within Canada and not try and deal with physical anthropology by Canadians in other places, simply because I think what we're dealing with here is more the within Canada aspect of it. So it's practice of the discipline practice of the discipline within Canada. And it's the origins are clearly 19th century and part of the discipline both here in North America and in Europe. Certainly focused initially within the osteology anthropometry aspect. And certainly my own background is within this, and in terms of the Canadian history of the subject and in fact of training for both of us, the bulk of the training up until approximately late 70s, early 80s is the anthropometry osteology aspect, with osteology being the primary side here. Modern terms, the early work, of course, as it is the whole of this subject, is framed within typological, and in modern day terms, were the whole business of racial origins. Throwing Frank Spencer's History of Physical Anthropology in a fourth-year class one year was fascinating because a lot of the students didn't understand the degree to which racial stereotypes were standard within most academic disciplines well into the period between the First and the Second World War. So, a basis here. If I come across as nervous, I am on this. Apart from a lecture I gave on Tuesday at Simon Fraser, this is the first time I've given a paper in front of an audience in over 5 years. This is what in retirement has done to me. I'm going to see. I've got almost as much hair as Jerry. So, some very early sort of landmarks. Earliest papers are middle of the 19th century. King's description of Eskimo, based on work during the hunt for John Ross, who disappeared into the high Arctic. And the book on the 3 years' work, and interestingly, same people involved later in the search for Franklin in the next decade. And the one name here, for those of you who do northern work, of course, is that the river in what I believe is Nunavut, in northern Nunavut, is the Back River. The comment here that it was under the command of Captain Back. It's a period when very basic exploration was occurring in Canada. Earliest period papers in a Canadian source shortly afterwards. Daniel Wilson's work, which is very typical of what would have been called physical anthropology or its predecessor in the 19th century, largely based on cranial types, very, very, very traditional on this. And Wilson himself, within the 19th century tradition, very definitely a polymath, a person who covered a huge area. So chair of history and English, later president of the University of Toronto. Clearly, if you had to name one person as the source for anthropology as a whole in Canada, Wilson is probably that person, or certainly is one of only a small handful of people. By the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century, we start to get into work that led to findings and data. Some of the data, for example, from here, the Boaz data, has recently been mined. I believe there was a paper within the last 20 years in HAPA on the whole business and accuracy of using Boaz's original data from the coast, which I believe is archived at the Smithsonian, but I'm not sure of that, the archival aspect. But in this case, Wilson, along with Charles Dawson, And the initial very large project, the BAAS, British Association for the Advancement of Science, in this case, the Anthropology of Tribes of British Columbia, you start digging into this, the articles just sort of come all over the place, not the least of which Franz Boas's work, which stemmed from this. And there are papers over a 30-year period by Boas looking at material up and down the northwest coast. And from that and the later Jessup North Pacific expedition. By the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, you start to get a coalescence here, so that the first sort of anthropological identification is in the division at what was then the Victoria Museum on Metcalfe Street, became the National Museum, is now the Museum of Civilization, and is about to become something else. And I think, let me put it this way, I think I have developed a black hole for the latest one. We'll leave it. But anyway, founded in 1910, immediately before the First World War, first physical anthropologist shortly afterwards in Francis Knowles, who only lasted 5 years before retiring due to ill health, although he went back to England and lived another, what are we talking about, 30-something years. But it is interesting in this case that Knowles was not in fact replaced at the museum until 1958.
Right, Jerry?
At that time you were 18 months old? So in the period from there, we got a little bit more in terms of filling out on this. A lot of work in the Arctic. Northwest coast of the late 19th, early 20th century. The time you get into the period between the wars, during the First World War and then between the wars, it's the two great expeditions to the north, which opened up much of our knowledge of the north, including much of the basis of Arctic archaeology, is framed in these two, especially in the Fifth Thule expedition. If you're in archaeology, names like Knud Rasmussen and Kai Burkett Smith are huge names. This is Danish. There's a Danish base. Knud Rasmussen was half Danish, half Greenland Eskimo in this. And in both cases led to long-term stays in the Arctic. And afterwards, major publications, both the Canadian Arctic Expedition and even more so the Fifth Thule, produced massive volumes across the book of anthropology. At that point, you've sort of got a base, and the first person comes in with what I would refer to as a direct relationship to what happened, what are we talking about, 30 years later. Not quite 40, but 30 years later. J.C. Boileau Grant, if you don't know the name before, but have taken anatomy, Grant's anatomy. This is the man. Scottish born, a large number of medical people were Scottish born. The influence of the Scots on Canadian medical development is enormous. His anthropological work, survey work, is largely while he was in Manitoba. A whole set of monographs published by the National Museum from the 30s to, I think, mid-20s.
1929.
1929 for the first one? Okay. And in 1930 came to Toronto, where he was head for the next 30 years. As his comment will come up later, he then becomes the person who, in a sense, provides the catalyst for the development of the Toronto program in physical anthropology. So best known for Grant's Atlas. And known also, this one of the typical of the work he did. They're largely descriptive in modern terms. but they're data that have never been replicated on this. He then, after coming to Toronto, and after the Second World War, began the interaction with the anthropology department. And I'm not going to go into the history of the Department of Anthropology, other than to say that it was founded in the 1920s, I believe. It was largely social anthropology with a little bit of archaeology, and a couple of times physical anthropology was taught by a non-physical anthropologist. But it is this influence after 1950 that leads to the development of the program there. And by the way, simply as an aside, I was going to make this comment at the beginning. If at the beginning of this and through the next sort of section, you say, isn't this very Toronto-centric? I'll simply put in the comment here, two comments really. One of them is that prior to 1980, there is only, to my knowledge, one PhD thesis in English in physical anthropology from a department other than the University of Toronto. The only reason for making a question mark here is I did not have time to do the work necessary to explore what had happened at Montreal. But I think it may stand out. I don't think that there were any early PhDs at Montreal either. But I may be wrong there. But other than that, the Toronto base is critical to the subject in Canada. So just before going on into this, I think I have one slide here. Yes, before getting really to where we to the modern period and people who you have either heard of or in some cases definitely know. So in this period, other things going on, and I'll just that influence other parts of the discipline. The Queen's Arctic Expedition, surprisingly not known. I mean, there's a huge literature from this, with Malcolm Brown's name on it. I did early bibliographic work on physical anthropology and human biology in Canada, and you just, in this period, from the late 40s to the early 60s, there's just there have got to be 20 to 30 papers that came out of those from the medical school at Queen's, and a very strong base for work that occurred later on human adaptation to cold, which became an enormous subject in the 60s. The other one, of course, is the whole Arctic medicine aspect. And those of you of my generation will probably know all three of Jacques Hildy's, Jacques Leblanc, and Otto Schaefer, who were very much around at Toronto in the late 60s and early 70s. And for somebody who went to Winnipeg, of course, was one of the centers. Jacques Hildy's at the University of Manitoba, huge program. Otto Schaefer, first with National Health and Welfare, and I think then with the Charles Camsell Hospital. Basically all of the health work, respectively, in the Eastern and Western Arctic over a period of 30 plus years, I think, something of that order. Basically, the founding, for those are the circumpolar health conferences that began in the 70s, largely due to the work of Hildy's, Schaefer, the people in Denmark, and 2 or 3 people in the States. So very much an international influence. But of course, Canada with the huge element here. The genetic side, also a Manitoba one. One forgets often that Manitoba was in many ways the center of a lot of the early medical work. The blood group lab became the RH lab. I think it's now the Chown lab. But Bruce Chown's work, huge in description of blood groups, but in medical terms, the lab which I believe was responsible for breakthroughs in the whole business of RH, palliative aspects of treating the whole problem of RH and childbirth. All of that work, all of the early work done at the University of Manitoba. And that base also led to the Human Adaptability Project at Igloolik in the Canadian North, which was parallel to work in Greenland and in Alaska. And in one way, this is where my first job as a graduate student at the University of Toronto was to prepare a bibliography of all of the studies on Canadian physical anthropology and human biology as background to the HAP project. And that finally appeared in a revised format due to Jerry's assistance and help in the middle 1980s and was published as a National Museum monograph. It's one of the ways I managed to work my way through graduate school. So, we get to Toronto in the late 50s, early 60s. Introduced two individuals here. Again, some of you will be very familiar. I couldn't find a better picture of Jim. Probably needed to do more work, and if I'd had a little, and sort of blitzed people and said, you've got better pictures. So Jim at the top, Jim Anderson, Larry Oshinsky at the bottom here. Jim was trained by Boileau Grant, started teaching in anatomy, and then moved across, first of all, between the two departments and then into anthropology. Larry Oshinsky came to the National Museum, the first person to be there since Knowles had left in 1919. The third person, and as I said before, I haven't had the time to explore the Montreal connection, is Jean Benoit at the Université de Montréal. The other two people at Montreal at this period were Jacques Gomila and Frank Auger. And Frank's name will come back because Frank was the first president of this association. So a quick profile of Jim and then Larry, and we're going to get to CAPA in a moment. And how am I doing here? I better speed up a bit. Jim, 1926, 1995, MD, not a PhD. He was an anatomist. He was an anatomist and pathologist whose interest in paleopathology brought him into anthropology. I think that's the fairest way to put it on this. Student of Grant's. He certainly saw Grant as his mentor in this case. Moved to the department in the late 50s in this. Was at Toronto for 6 years, late 50s, early 60s. The break is his period from 63 to 66 at SUNY Buffalo, and then back to Toronto. And then in 1969, he was approached to be the founder of the anatomy program at the McMaster Medical School. The break, to Buffalo and the return has got to do with Larry Oshinsky's death in this case. Basically, all physical anthropology graduate students at Toronto over about a 12+ year period were taught by Jim on this. And two of the initial three PhDs are directed by him, Nancy Ossenberg, Jerry Melby. The other two students, Jerry and Bob Sundick. In this case, Nancy Ossenberg, one difference in this case, Nancy is the only one who did not get her degree through anthropology. When I was doing the searching for this, I said, why isn't Nancy's name in the Toronto list? This is the anthropology department's archival list, which is on the web. And the answer is her PhD is from anatomy, which also explains why she ended up not in an anthropology department, but in the Department of Anatomy at Queen's University, because that's what she was. She was trained as an anatomist. So in this case, this is the core, really, for the program over the next decade, almost 15 years. And even longer if you actually consider the record in terms of PhDs produced, because the osteology program has probably produced, I would guess, close to 3/4 of the total of the PhDs in physical anthropology from Toronto. It's a huge percentage. So very much, you get a situation in which in this country, I'll give you the American equivalent, and it's about a generation earlier. This country, and Jerry and I are getting to the end of the group, there are those who are students of Anderson's and those who are students of Anderson's in this case. The equivalent in the States, which probably played out in the 50s and 60s, still was present when I went to Pennsylvania in '67, was a huge percentage of American physical anthropologists were the old generation, the old guard, were students of Houghton's. The next generation were students of Houghton's. It's a huge, huge percentage at the period immediately after the Second World War in this. Larry Oshinsky, very different kettle of fish on this. I worked with him and I'm not sure that I could have survived a PhD with him. Larry was a person of very strong opinions. For those who knew Larry at AAPA meetings, he was the person who would sort of stick in the knife and then slowly turn it. And Larry divided everybody in the discipline. I can remember sitting in a seminar of his senior course, graduate course in physical anthropology in the 60s, and Larry made it quite clear that there were two groups of physical anthropologists in North America. There were the good guys and there were the bad guys. And we knew very clearly who the good guys and the bad guys were. His favorite target was Frank Livingston. He would walk up to Frank Livingston during an AAP meeting and he would say, "Dr. Livingston, I presume," and then would walk off. He was force majeure, I think is the word. He was a force of nature. He was American, trained at Chicago, then went to Zurich, and I think trained with Schlagenhofen, trained with one of these people who was at the very end of his career. The person who trained him was one of these people in the European tradition who had been in the chair by the time Larry got there for probably 40 plus years. You get a number of these cases of this. So very much trained in classical tradition. I came to National Museum, then to the University of Toronto. He was only there for the 2 years because he went home to Christmas, for Christmas '65. I was 18 months into my program. He never came back. He had a massive heart attack, and we were all sitting in Toronto and wondering what was going to happen. And in the following term, and you would have seen it from the Buffalo end, Jim commuted 2 days a week from Buffalo to Toronto to pick up the teaching load, and then he came back to Toronto the next year. So, in this case, important influence of those at Toronto. People like myself, you mentioned Lindsay Neiman, you mentioned Jim MacDonald, Jeff Garrity was there, and that really is it. The other people in the group were largely cultural anthropologists who were taking Larry's courses. And he never did complete any. With only 2 years, there are no students of him. There are still people who were taught by Oshinsky, including myself. My master's thesis is derived from Larry's work, followed up some of his ideas on this, but there are no people who were fully trained by Larry. Just to quickly mention, here, the one I'll come back to is the second here. People at the time, and I'm not going to mention anybody from the next generation. Bin Yamaguchi, Japanese, did work on Ainu and Australian Aboriginals, was there for 3 years in the 60s. Were you there when Bin was there? And the other early PhD student, Mike Pietraszewski, who went to Hawaii, has been there ever since, was the other one, a PhD from '69. David Hughes joined after, I think Jim went to McMaster in this case, had a number of students. He was in fact my PhD supervisor by default, because it started with Jim, who then went to McMaster, and David became mine, and produced a number of students over the next decade or so. And I mentioned Ted Reed simply, who was adjunct in the department, and with a single PhD steered to my... Two was there a second?
Yes, but I'm having a senior moment, I can't remember.
Okay.
And I was actually her external examiner about 20 years ago. She was originally a student from Trent and went to Toronto to do her PhD. She did work on immunoglobulins.
Okay, okay. I didn't try tracking. Well, I found
Her
very
name will
little.
come to me.
I found very little, and certainly not a list of his students.
Well, you mentioned Oshinsky, and Oshinsky and Ed Reed were kind of famous in the sense that Oshinsky had taken Ed Reed's human genetics course, which is where I met Jerry Cebulski, and at the end of that, he concluded that genetics was irrelevant to physical anthropology. There was no love lost.
Oh, this was Larry?
Larry.
Oh yeah, I mean, oh yeah, let me put it this way. If you were doing blood, oh, you know, it was I'm trying to think what I'd call it. That your damnation in hell was Boyd's blood group. What was it called? Blood groups
in man.
Blood groups in man. Oh yeah, that was fit for burning on that. Oh yeah, Larry was opinionated. Is the most polite way to put it on this. So the context for CAPA is within this frame of reference on this. So by 1970, there were 12 of us teaching across the country. But if you look at the actual, if you actually look at the spread here, it's a